Welcome to the One-to-One podcast, brought to you by the Learning Technology Center of Illinois. The LTC is a program of the Illinois State Board of Education. We support all K-12 districts, schools, and educators in Illinois through technology initiatives, services, and professional learning opportunities.
Our work addresses high-need technology and digital learning challenges, and we help schools increase access to and use of technology to improve educational opportunities for students. Our hosts are
Brian Bates, Associate Executive Director for Professional Learning.
and Matt Jacobson, Online Learning Coordinator. Let's get started. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Hi, Brian. I haven't seen you on the podcast for several weeks. We all needed to take a little spring break to kind of rest and refresh. I hope your break away from the podcast, at least, was relaxing and productive.
Yeah, it was a good time away from the recording process, though. It's good to be back and getting a few more episodes here before the end of the school year, which is not very far away.
It's kind of creepy as close as it is. You know, people are getting ready to wrap up the school year and so on, and trying to avoid thinking about next year and in the future, and just kind of thinking, let's get this year done with and enjoy summer vacation.
Yeah, I imagine there's some countdowns already started in schools across the state and across the country of, I bet you could ask almost any student right now how many days of school left, and they know probably down to the hour or minute how many days left there are. But the fun part about this time of year is it's time to really finish on a strong note, and that's kind of what we're hoping to do with the podcast. Also, finish our school year off with a strong push towards the end. So, you want to talk a little bit about who we're going to be chatting with today?
Well, today we are sort of kind of looking ahead past spring, summer vacation, I should say. We're going to take a look at the National Educational Technology Plan with Ji Soo Song from the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology. And we think of these big plans as being, oh no, here's another thing. But I think you'll find this one is a little more intriguing and applicable to our schools and classrooms. Would you agree?
Absolutely. When it comes out, when it came out back in January, you start looking through it and you're thinking that this is really well done, and it really makes a lot of sense. And it feels like something that can easily be incorporated within the things you're already doing. I'm so excited because of the how well it was done, and I'm really excited to have the conversation today. Definitely worth waiting a little bit to make sure we could get Ji Soo to be a part of this conversation, so he can share the work that he's done on the NETP with us, and with most importantly, the rest of our listeners.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's meet Ji Soo. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about something called the National Educational Technology Plan and how it affects schools and classrooms. And joining us today is Ji Soo Song. Ji Soo, can you tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, well, thanks first for having me on this podcast. My name is Ji Soo Song. As Matt mentioned, serving as the Digital Equity Advisor for the Office of EdTech, or OET, within the Department of Education. We're housed within the Policy Office that sits above OET. And my role is to lead some of the items that fall underneath the digital equity and inclusion priority bucket during this administration, helping advance digital equity, closing the digital access divide for learners furthest from opportunities. In the last 3 years that I've been here at the department, have had a chance to lead a number of different things, from our Digital Equity Education Roundtables initiative, where we had a chance to convene leaders from across the country to talk about some of the major barriers facing our students and families, identifying promising strategies to get around those barriers, and we were able to publish those learnings as part of a federal guidance back in 2022. Recently had a chance to also help, in collaboration with the White House, a national initiative called Online for All, to help more folks enroll in the Affordable Connectivity Program. And then as of the last year or so, pertaining to the topic of this podcast, I've had a chance to help support the development and the rollout of the 2024 National Ed Tech Plan. So that's a little bit about me, working really, hand in hand and collaboratively with not just folks internal to the Department of Education, but folks across different agencies, including NTIA sitting under the Department of Commerce, as well as the FCC, the infrastructure team at the White House, Domestic Policy Council. So I see myself serving as sort of like a glue between all of these different parties that are interested in, advancing digital equity for our students and their communities.
Okay. Wow. Well, thank you for carving out a few minutes of time to talk with us today.
Yeah, that's quite a list of things to do. And you said just over 3 years you've been with the department?
Yeah, this isn't actually my first time with the department. During the end of the Obama administration, I was actually an intern on 2 occasions at the same office. And then a couple of administrations later, I found myself back here. So I actually had a chance to help support the rollout of what was then the 2016 National Ed Tech Plan. But obviously had a bigger role this time around as, a fellow rather than an intern. So, yeah.
So you're a National Ed Tech Plan alumni then at this point, after being a part of 2 different plans.
Maybe, because I remember back in the 2016 NETP launch event, one of my biggest duties was to guard the White House cupcakes that we had ordered, which was a really fun duty. And then this time around, I actually got to speak on different panels and things like that, which was kind of cool. So, personally, it's been cool to see, myself growing over the last couple of years since the 2016 NETP has launched. But that's a bit of a side story. Yeah.
That's awesome. I like the idea of guarding cupcakes. But so we've talked a little bit already now about, and you mentioned that the focus of today's conversation is around the National Ed Tech Plan that was just released earlier this year. So I would imagine that most people listening would like to know, like, what is the National Ed Tech Plan, and why was it needed? Why is it needed?
Yeah. First of all, if you have never heard of the National Ed Tech Plan or the NETP, what are you doing? Just kidding. I love it when people say they haven't heard of the NETP, actually, because that means, we're doing our job to get the NETP in the hands of folks who, have never heard of it, right? I went to South by back in March and was just at ASU GSV. And during those sessions, I said, hey, no shame at all. Raise your hand if you've never heard the NETP. And like half the room raised their hands. And I'm like, thank you so much for coming, because I know I'm doing my job of letting more folks know that this policy document exists. So that tangent aside, the NETP, we sort of lovingly refer to it as the flagship policy document for the US on topics related to ed tech. It has a little bit of a history behind it. Back in the 90s, when the internet was just getting up and running and getting into more folks' hands, Congress was curious, how do we make sure that this thing can serve our students in their classrooms to really accelerate teaching and learning? So they actually passed a law requiring that the Department of Education publish a long-range strategic plan on how to take advantage of educational technology for teaching and learning. So the first NETP, I believe, was published back in '96. Well, a couple of things have happened since the 90s in the last 3 decades. So the good thing is we've had an opportunity to revise the National Ed Tech Plan, usually every 4 to 6 years. This revision came a little bit late due to delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The last NETP came in 2016 with a little bit of revision in 2017 as well. So yeah, with that history aside, it sort of helps set the national vision around what we mean by the phrase effective use of technology for teaching and learning. And it offers some system level recommendations of how we can arrive at that vision collectively. The development process of the 2024 NETP was pretty thorough. We sort of ran the numbers when we were preparing for our launch event at the White House back in January, and we realized that, hey, we engaged over 1,000 individuals and stakeholders in the development process through different surveys, different focus groups, interviews like this, and things like that. So that was really great to see that a really representative sample of our country, contributed to this policy document. So yeah, and then I'll get into this a little bit later, but the 2024 NETP really focuses around bridging what we call the three digital divides. So that's digital use, digital design, and digital access. So I can get more into each of those as we get further deeper into the conversation. But something that I'll also mention that I really like about this version of the NETP is that it includes examples from all 50 states, the District of Columbia, 2 US territories, as well as the juvenile justice system, to really emphasize the point that all the recommendations that we make throughout the NETP, no matter where you are in the country, no matter whether you're in a red state, a blue state, an urban region, a rural region, there is a starting point for you, and there are leaders across the country at the district, at the state levels, who have done this work exemplifying what can be done. So I really like the examples that are scattered throughout the NETP. And then we also recently published a blog to supplement the National EdTech Plan with calls to action for the developer community, right? If we're making recommendations on the demand side of things at the district and state levels, we thought we should make calls to action for the supply side of the equation as well. So we published some high impact recommendations for the developer community, and we shared that with attendees at South by Southwest EDU this year. So that's a little bit about the NETP, its history, and why I'm a fan of this particular version of the National EdTech Plan. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can tell you, as people who live in the ed tech world, we are also a fan of the NETP. So
that's really good to hear. Yeah.
True, and we'll put a link to those to that blog post and the recommendations and call to action into the show notes for this episode, everyone. So, Ji Soo, you've told us a little bit about the kind of a high level, what is the NETP? If I'm in a classroom, if I'm a school leader, or if I'm a student, how will this impact those stakeholders?
Yeah. There's an example that I like to use when talking about what the National EdTech Plan, recommends that we do together to impact schools, teachers, and students. It's kind of a long-winded example, so please feel to pause me if there's any confusion, right? Sure. Let's say there's an 8th grade student, and for this fictional example, we'll call her Jane, right? Today, she's sitting in her science classroom, and what's a typical 8th grade science topic? Forces, motion, that kind of thing. Her teacher has given all the students a textbook. You're going to read a chapter about this topic, and then next week, we're going to take a quiz on it to see if you've understood the concepts. Or maybe Jane attends a one-to-one school, right? And the textbook is actually an online textbook that's integrated as part of a district-wide learning management system, right? And the activity is the same. She's going to read it and then understand the concept, and then next week she's going to take the quiz. Something to know about our student Jane is that she has a reading disability, so she's reading a little bit behind her grade level. So with the assignment that she's been given, she's a little bit frustrated. She's growing a little bit anxious that she's going to fail the quiz next week. So it's not an ideal situation for her. So this student's example, which can be found all across the country, really exemplifies the three digital divides that we talk about in the National Ed Tech Plan. So I'll go through each of them and sort of examine how they show up in the case of our student Jane, right? The first digital divide is the digital use divide, which was actually first discussed in the 2016 NETP. And it's the gap that exists between students who are asked to use technology in very active ways, engaging in activities that make them analyze different data, create different things using technology. So those more active learning experiences. And then the other side of the gap are students who are asked to use technology in much more passive ways, right? Watching a static piece of content, understanding the topic, and then, regurgitating it back out. Some research shows that our students furthest from opportunities, whether that be our students of color, students from low-income communities, they tend to be on the wrong side of the digital use divide. And through the NETP development process, we've learned that in some communities, even if it's school, even if a district may have access to more technology compared to, others of equivalent size, right? The students in that community might still be only subject to passive uses. So let's think about Jane, right? The assignment was to, read her textbook, whether it's a physical textbook or an online textbook, understand the concept and regurgitate it back out, right? It's a very passive, learning activity, whether it's technology-based or not, right? How do we make sure that we can use technology to think about an alternative active way for engaging Jane in that learning experience? So that's the first divide, the digital use divide. The second divide, the digital design divide, really talks about providing our teachers with time, space, capacity to design learning activities, design instructional activities that are more active and are grounded in the Universal Design for Learning framework, right? The UDL framework, I know a lot of folks in the education ecosystem know about it, but if you haven't heard about it, is a research-based framework created by CAST. Really calls on personalizing learning experiences, especially for our students with disabilities, by making sure that there's multiple modalities for representing content, engaging students, and allowing them to express that knowledge, right? So helping our educators receive coaching and professional development opportunities to use the UDL framework as a foundation for those active learning experiences. So again, going back to our student Jane, right? There was a very singular pathway for her to learn that concept, right? Forces, motion, and those kinds of things, right? It was to read that textbook and then sort of spit it back out. Maybe, when we think about Jane, even though she has that reading disability, maybe one of her greatest assets is her capacity for creativity, right? So instead of providing her with text-based content, if the learning goal is to understand those scientific concepts, maybe she could have been providing with different multimedia to engage with those same topics, right? Or instead of doing a multiple choice quiz to learn about Newton's the second law of motion, could she have demonstrated her learning through a online simulation, a presentation, some kind of video, things like that? There's multiple ways to use technology for her to express that knowledge, right? As the UDL framework recommends. So that's the digital design divide. It's very teacher facing, whereas the use divide is very student facing. The access divide is the one that's more sort of system level facing. And I think this is the term that folks most often associate when they think about the term digital divide, which has been in the national discourse since the pandemic and even before, right? So that's equitable access to digital connectivity, devices, content, things like that. But through our NETP development process, we knew that we had to include two additional things in our discussion of the access divide. So The first is accessibility, so that our students with disabilities can access the same learning opportunities compared to their peers using different features of different tools. And the other piece is digital health, safety, and citizenship, right? My colleague, Zach Chase, who's one of the authors of the 2024 NETP, makes the analogy between digital health, safety, and citizenship and like driver's ed, for example, because, you're handing students keys to this really powerful tool called technology that can help them explore, different things that they've never been able to explore, right? As we hand them the keys, we need to make sure to help them realize how to use this tool in safe, healthy, and responsible manners, right? So how do we make sure that that is, a part of the discussion around the access divide? So thinking back to our student Jane, if the content is text-based, could she have been provided at the very least some accessibility features of different ed tech tools to help her understand the concept a little better? Or maybe she has access to those tools from school, but what about if she leaves the school building, right? Does she have continuous access from home? If these LMSs are web-based, what if she's disconnected from home, right? So you can see, in this long example of Jane the student, how the three digital divides show up in her case. So the NETP includes 7 to 8 recommendations per section to close those three digital divides: use, design, and access, to make sure that our schools, teachers, and students are impacted by the National Ed Tech Plan.
I like how in that example you gave, it's very real world. Like, I can take it, the plan itself, it's absolutely worth going through and reading, but right there, that's a great way to just kind of say, this is how it impacts the individual student right away, without having to go through and read through and understand every single detail of the plan. So I appreciate that fictional student that you gave. During that conversation, you'd mentioned the NETP's recommendations, and that there were, I think you said 17 recommendations or so, or 7, maybe. I don't remember which number, but could you expand a little bit on some of those recommendations from the NETP for our listeners?
Yeah. And the number was 7 to 8 per section. Sorry if I misspoke.
Okay. No worries. I misheard.
No worries. One of our biggest goals this year with the National Ed Tech Plan out there is to help sort of translate its recommendations into action at the district levels, at the state level, at the school level. So we've been carrying these sort of core 5 recommendations to different presentations and discussion opportunities. So I'll dive into some these sort of core recommendations. The first is, everything starts with knowing where we want to go, right? So setting that vision. A lot of districts have taken steps to develop a portrait of a learner. So how do we, define a set of skills and competencies that we want students to graduate from the K-12 system with, right? But how do we also take that to develop a portrait of an educator? How do we take that to develop a portrait of a learning environment? And how do we examine how technology can serve as an accelerator for each of the elements of those portraits, right? So I know the state of Nevada, the Nevada Department of Education has documented their process of developing that kind of a portrait. So that example is included in the National Ed Tech Plan. And something that we really like from the work that they've led is that they engaged a lot of different stakeholders in the development of this shared vision at their state, right? It wasn't just school communities, but also the business sector, the private sector, the social sector, to make sure that truly the skills and competencies that we want students to come out of the K-12 system with are going to be, relevant no matter where they go within that state, right? So setting that vision really comes first, because everything sort of falls underneath. The second, really pertaining to the digital design divide, is helping our teachers build capacity around the universal design for learning framework, right? Providing them with not just one and done 30-minute professional development sessions and how a learning management system's cool feature does. I used to be in a 3rd grade classroom, and I remember those kinds of PD sessions, and you're just like, what did I really get out of that? And like, am I actually going to use that feature that, I got a 20-minute overview on with 10 minutes of icebreakers, right? How do we make sure that, it's a really continuous cycle of coaching that helps folks develop familiarity with the Universal Design for Learning framework and think about how different technologies can serve as a tool to provide those multiple modalities for expression, for representation, and for engagement, right? In the NETP, we talk about the fact that there's a lot of federal grants from the Department of Education that can help with that kind of professional development effort, which is captured in our 2023 Dear Colleague letter. But something that we're trying to really communicate to states and districts to really help them, think smarter about spending, is that we can't spend all. There's a time and place for it. Don't get me wrong, but we can't spend all that resource on tool training, right, and call it mission accomplished, right? I know the folks from Learn Platform do an annual survey to see how many, ed tech tools educators, students, districts access in a given year, and it's a lot, right? So trying to do tool training at that kind of a scale, kind of a losing battle. So how do we make sure that our educators are developed on those, research-based instructional frameworks first, so that they have agency to bring in different tools that they know about to sort of build on that instructional framework, right? I know in Indiana, we highlight a school district, I think it's called Bartholomew School District, where this is part of their culture, right? Teachers aren't just trained on how to use technologies just for the sake of deploying technology, but to really intentionally provide those multiple modalities of expression, engagement, and representation. So I encourage you all to check out that example. The third piece is rethinking our procurement policies and practices, right? How do we make sure that, from the get-go, we are purchasing ed tech tools that meet baseline expectations around learner variability, accessibility, data privacy, and all the different things that the NETP calls for. I know in our sort of smaller rural and remote districts, they may not have the capacity to vet each and every tool that they're looking at. So it's something really cool that a lot of different trusted organizations like ISTE, Digital Promise, CAST, and a bunch of other organizations have done is to create a sort of a third-party validator or a seal that can really help sort of fast track that kind of procurement and purchasing decision, right? To get a second opinion on whether this tool that really, serves learner variability, meets data privacy requirements, leverages, best practices when it comes to digital pedagogy and things like that. So how do we make sure that we sort of look at those factors when we think about procurement? It's not a one-to-one example, but I think we highlighted an example of a district out in Missouri where the district's accessibility coordinator is part of the team that does procurement, so that they can provide a check and a balance always when a purchasing decision is made, so that it's not an afterthought. Like, we're not deploying technology to different schools and realizing, Jane, who has this reading disability, can't use it because of X, Y, and Z reasons, right? So they're making sure that they're tackling that problem even before it starts. So that's the third one. The fourth one that we talk about is defining our metrics, right? A lot of states, a lot of districts have done some really great work to see, which ed tech licenses are being used where. Are we taking advantage of the full width of licenses that we purchase and things like that? But how do we think about going beyond that adoption question to think about how it actually gets implemented in the classroom, right? Is it continuing to propagate those passive uses of technology, or is that tool being used to create really active learning experiences for our students, right? The Office of Ed Tech did a survey with the National Center for Education Statistics, I think back in 2019. The results are released in 2021. I'll provide that link if I can find the link to that survey. But asks questions that maybe districts and states can also ask of their schools to see how the ed tech that they purchase actually gets implemented, whether for passive learning experiences or active learning experiences. So that's the fourth one. And then the fifth call to action recommendation that we sort of carry around as we talk about the NETP is ensuring effective governance structures, right? All of the things that I just talked about, from setting a vision, building capacity, rethinking procurement, defining metrics, closing those use, design, and access divides, can happen a lot more smoothly when there's buy-in from leadership at the state and district levels, right? So the NETP asks a question of states and districts: do you have an EdTech director that oversees policies, procurement, different practices, coordinating different items at the cabinet level, that reports directly to the state chief or the district superintendent, right? Because a lot of these different recommendations can happen, again, a lot more smoothly when there's that leadership figurehead, right? I know in states like North Carolina, their state ed tech director is part of the cabinet that sits under the state chief. St. Vrain Valley School District is another district that we highlight in the NETP. And with the right sort of effective governance structures at play, I think they were able to create like an innovative technology vetting framework where teachers can see, oh, I want to use this tool in my classroom. Who are the folks that I need to consult? What are the resources available to me? And what are the questions that I should be asking before deploying different tools? So the innovation team that's part of the superintendent's cabinet is able to do those things because they have that buy-in at the leadership level. So those are the 5 sort of, I guess, like power recommendations, if you will, that we like to sort of communicate to different folks as we carry the NETP around the country. Again, that's setting a vision, knowing where we want to go, building capacity, making sure that our teachers have ongoing professional development opportunities grounded in UDL, rethinking procurement, defining our metrics to go beyond adoption, and thinking about whether it propagates passive use or leverages active use, and then ensuring effective governance. Yeah.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about the document itself. Like, where can I find it? How long is it going to take me to get through it? That kind of thing. Because that's a lot of work you've done.
Yeah, our office tries to keep our URLs pretty simple so that folks can find it easily. tech.ed.gov/NETP is where you'll find our National Ed Tech Plan. Something that I'll mention is when you think about the appendices of a federal policy document, it doesn't seem like the most exciting thing to read, but our appendices are a little bit different because we realize that when it comes to education leaders, they simply don't have time to read the entirety of a 113-page policy document, right? So we try to boil those recommendations down as much as possible to 2-pagers for states, districts, schools, and educators, so they can see, okay, if I want to, engage in the work to close these 3 digital divides, where are my starting points, right? So encourage you to take a look at those appendices. And then we also have our story engine platform that sort of captures, again, all of the stories that are embedded throughout the National Ed Tech Plan, which you can find on tech.ed.gov/stories. So you can find that as well. Yeah.
Okay. And if anyone has questions, wants to learn more from you or others in the Office of Educational Technology, how can they get in touch with you or others?
Our office's email is ed.tech@ed.gov. There is a person behind that email address. I swear you, it's not going into the nether and like no one sees it, right? Sometimes it happens with like general inboxes. You send an email and you're just like, who actually reads that, right? But I do. Somebody else does within our office on a daily basis, so that if folks have questions, we can direct to the right person. So please feel free to send those questions over to that email address. You can also find us on social. If you look up Office of Educational Technology on platforms like X, you should be able to find us and engage with us there. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier, I'm sorry to kind of go off
No worries,
script
yeah.
here. You mentioned earlier those dear colleague letters. Um, can you tell us a little bit more about that initiative?
Yeah. So the Dear Colleague letter is a tool that the federal government uses often to clarify policy items that weren't clear in like legislation or different regulations because they're kind of broad, right? So diving deeper into some policy items that to make sure that it's clear for folks, right? So what we try to do with this Dear Colleague letter is say, hey, there's a lot of grants within the Department of Education, from the Every Student Succeeds Act to the COVID relief dollars, from those coming from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. You can use the dollars from those grants towards activities that the NETP calls for, whether it be ensuring connectivity and devices for students, ensuring coaching and professional development opportunities for teachers to learn about effective uses of technology. So it tries to clarify which grants can be used for which purposes that may not have been clear from the legislation that it comes from. So we had a chance to revise that and release that in 2023, and we reiterate that in the National EdTech Plan as well. Yeah.
I think I think these are all important things. We think of things that come down from, that big enigmatic, the government, the feds, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And we're like, oh my gosh, this is going to be difficult to read and time consuming, and I won't really understand it when I'm done. But the NETP is really much more streamlined than that and much more informative than that. I think, in my personal opinion, it's much more user friendly, whether you're a teacher or a school leader, much more user friendly to understand what it's really about and how we can use it to advocate for digital equity throughout our schools and communities.
Yeah, and if you all in the audience, if you would like a sort of like a more focused briefing on the National EdTech Plan or any other sort of deliverables from the Office of EdTech, please feel free to reach out to that email address that we shared at the question prior to this one. Because we've been able to engage with different state teams that way to make sure that they understand, how can we take the NETP and California-fy it, Indiana-fy it, or Utah-fy it, right? So, yeah.
To Illinois-fy it.
Yeah.
That's. I think you just coined a word.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I appreciate your time. Matt and I both do.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of great information in here, and it's a great starting point to processing the NETP. And I love the idea that, we've got an example student that we can see what it looks like. And then when it comes to the recommendations, there's specific call outs to, hey, you want to see something that we think exemplifies this recommendation? Here, check it out. And this is, maybe it doesn't work for you, but it gives you the idea of where to go with it by giving specific examples of what people are already doing. So I think that the rollout of the NETP is going well from my perspective, and I hope it's going well from yours also. But we just want to say thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today, and we appreciate your time.
Appreciate you all for inviting me to this chat, and hopefully, we get a lot more folks knowing about the NETP because of this podcast. So thank you again for this time.
Thanks, Ji Soo.
Yep.
Brian, that was an amazing and eye-opening kind of overview of the National Educational Technology Plan.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, and you wouldn't expect to get a great conversation centered around a document, but it was fantastic. And I know I mentioned it while we were speaking with Ji Soo, but the way that you can drill it down and give a specific example of how this can impact one particular student I think is incredibly powerful. That it's not just this theoretical thing that lives out in space where you're wondering, what does that look like in my classroom? How does that impact me as a regular, just a normal everyday classroom teacher? How does this impact me? And like, there's perfect examples sprinkled throughout this plan of ways that it does directly impact individual students. So I thought that was really a powerful part of the conversation.
And as far as examples go, those examples of the great things that are being implemented in all the states and territories, even so many times when we hear about an initiative or something from the state or national level, we think, oh, well, that's great, but that would never work here. And those examples show that, well, maybe it could. Maybe some of these could work, and because they are working elsewhere. So that brings this big sort of enigmatic plan down into something that is achievable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
the other thing that I think about when you consider, oh, there's a new plan, and that's the first thing that always pops into your head when you think about education and new plans and things like that, is another thing to add to my plate. Well, as you listen to Ji Soo talk about the main recommendations of the NETP, none of those are things that you would do that you're not already doing. Talking about setting a vision, you're already creating a vision for what education looks like in your district or in your school or even in your classroom itself. Even thinking about the idea about procurement. I mean, you're buying and refreshing devices already. Why not think about those external factors that might influence, how you purchase or what you purchase? Rethinking those devices, all the way down to taking data, defining the metrics and looking at how it's being used and ways to improve the use, and then making sure that the educators have the capacity to use the devices. So it's not really another set of steps that go into the everyday process of running the district or running a school. It's just it includes a piece related to that ed tech into that normal strategic planning process.
Yeah, it's really, how can we support what we know works, right?
Absolutely.
And the focus on UDL and really thoughtful. A lot of people think of UDL, well, that's a special education thing, and I don't have to deal with it. Well, it's thoughtful instructional design that works, that honestly benefits every student in your classroom and your school. So that focus is and providing agency. I think that was kind of the nice thing about the whole plan. It's not you must. It's like, here are different ways that you can.
Yeah, I like that. Not you must, but you can. I like that.
Yeah. So folks, if you haven't already taken a look at it, please get out there. We'll include links in the show notes so that one click will take you right to the NETP. You can download it, look through it, and you can also look through it online without downloading if you prefer, and kind of see some of the highlights right on their website. So encourage you to get out there and take a look at the NETP and start having conversations about that ed tech plan and how it can benefit your schools and classrooms.
Absolutely. That's great.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you back here again, wherever you get your podcasts in the coming weeks.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the LTC One-to-One podcast.
You can find and subscribe to this video podcast on YouTube.
Or listen to the audio by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast was produced by the Learning Technology Center of Illinois, a program of the Illinois State Board of Education. Learn more about the LTC at ltcillinois.org.